Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
The concept of convicting someone is part of what we're trying to do here, not just convincing someone that there's a God. That just gets them to the table, so to speak, like we talked about last week. Secondly, the first lesson was an introductory lesson. Those that are watching on YouTube, if you're looking for proof of a God or evidence of a God, that will come in the next 8 lessons, so bear with me on that. Last week was simply an introduction. We'll get into the more proofs, if you will. But if you're looking for one absolute proof of God, it's like we talked about last week, it's evidences. It's what the preponderance of evidence is. That's where the proof comes from. God's not going to present himself to us in person. He did 2,000 years ago, and he was rejected by most men, but that's not happening now. But we have proof that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and again, that there is a God. So tonight's lesson, we're going to be looking, the first proof against materialism more than a proof of a God, is looking at materialism itself. Materialism itself, and showing that materialism is a bankrupt philosophy, if you want to use that term, or bankrupt idea, and it has problems from the very beginning. So we talked about this last week about a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. This is from Jason Liesel. He is a creation astrophysicist. He works a lot with the Ken Ham group, and he says, our worldview is composed of a network of our most basic beliefs about reality, in light of which all observations are interpreted, and our worldview contains the most strongly held convictions about how the world works, how it came to be, the nature of reality, and the nature of truth, and how we should live. And we mentioned last week, there are 2 broad worldviews. There is the materialistic worldview, which we'll spend time on tonight, and then there's the spiritual worldview, but tonight we're going to call it the biblical worldview, and that's more specific when it comes to the spiritual worldview. We're going to look at the biblical worldview, which is the worldview, I would say, in everybody in this room probably, is the biblical worldview. But we base our interpretation in science a lot of times based on these worldviews. How we view the science, how we view the evidence is based upon this conception of what our worldview is. Can you change your worldview? Yes, that's what we're doing these lessons. Yes, you can change your worldview, and that's what our attempt to do is, but they are sometimes really grounded in someone. And it's difficult sometimes to change that view. And so these people come very convicted that there cannot be any supernaturalism and that the world had to come about by purely materialistic means, even when the evidence is so clear to the contrary, because they hold such a very strong worldview. It can't be any other way. And we're going to look at a quote in just a minute that shows what I'm talking about. Josh Gertler, again, a microbiologist, member of the Church of Christ, he says our worldview tells us how to treat the evidence, thus how to conduct science. So even how science can be conducted or is conducted can be influenced by a person's worldview. And some say, well, you can't conduct science with a biblical worldview. Oh, that's contrary. That's not true. Much science has been conducted and continues to be conducted by people that believe in a God and believe in even Jesus Christ. Jay Richards has put it real. I think this is a succinct way of stating what the materialist worldview is. And that is, the materialists believe the material world is all there is, matter colliding with matter. And that is about as basic as you can get. That's all there is. It's matter colliding with matter. There is no purpose. There is nothing intelligent behind it. Everything comes about by chance. And it's simply matter colliding with matter. And that has serious consequences as a result of that, which we will look at as well. Now, this is Joyce Carol Oates, who is a materialist, but she says, and this is, I think, a funny quote, and that's why I have it on here, and that is, nothing is accidental in the universe except the entire universe itself, which is pure accident. So we understand that the laws of physics don't allow for accidents to occur. That's what I think she's meaning by this verse, and yet the materialist has to say that the world came about, the universe came about by pure accident, because otherwise you'd have to have an intelligence behind it. And that's exactly correct. This is the quote I was talking about. This is Richard Lewitton. And he's still alive. I think he's in his 90s now, but a very devout evolutionist materialist. And look at what he says about materialism and their point of view, because it's very telling. And he says, when he says we, he's talking about the materialist here, okay? We take the side of science, and again, materialist wants to use science apart from the creationist, and we should never let them do that, but I'm quoting him at this point. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of the constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. He's talking about evolution there, in my opinion, because there's a lot of just so stories, and that's all they are. Because we have a prior commitment, and this is the reason they're willing to accept these constructs and these just so stories and these extravagances, he calls it. They have a prior commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and intuitions of science somehow compel us to accept a natural explanation of phenomenal world. They just do. There's nothing that compels them, they just do. But on the contrary, we are forced by our prior adherence to natural causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanation, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And there he's talking about the ignorant people such as you and me who don't believe them, the uninitiated. But again, it's this prior commitment that they have, and it, no matter how mystifying it is. So you can tell them how illogical their stories are, but it doesn't matter. And at the very end, this is the one that you may see from time to time. He says, moreover, that materialism is absolute, but we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Just can't let it happen. So talking about those pair of glasses we talked about last week and how people see things differently. This is the materialist, which I would say has blinders on. They will not see the evidence, and it's hard to get through that. It's hard to change that, but it can be, but it's very, very difficult if they're not going to accept any other explanation, no matter how evident it is. Now, for the for the materialist, the explanation of the universe comes about through the Big Bang. And I'm just briefly talking about these things. We will talk about them in a little bit more detail in a later study. They present three evidences, but I would like to say this. Whether there's a Big Bang or not doesn't prove or disprove materialism, okay? It doesn't necessarily, you could have a Big Bang and the materialists still be wrong. I don't believe that's the way the earth was created, but I want to say that right now. It doesn't prove their point. But this is how they think earth came about, is through a Big Bang event. And abundance of light elements, that's hydrogen and helium in the universe, and there's a overabundance of those elements, and they seem to say that proves a Big Bang to occur. An expanding universe, which seems to be true. Our universe does seem to be expanding. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a later study. And then there's the presence of cosmic background radiation, which we'll also study. It's the third one that's probably the most difficult one for us to look at, but we will spend some time on it. But I will say this as a prior statement to those, quote, evidences of a Big Bang, that they can all be explained other ways besides just using the Big Bang theory. They are accurate, though. There is an abundance of light elements. The universe does seem to be expanding, and Psalms talks about how the earth seems to be expanding, so it's a biblical concept. And there is the presence of cosmic background radiation. You can't deny that. It's there. We'll look at these a little bit more in detail later. So for the materialist, the appearance of design is an illusion. They won't deny that the universe, biological systems, seem to have been designed, but for them it's an illusion. It's strictly an illusion. And hence you have Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. Yeah, you know, the idea that a watch wouldn't suddenly appear in the field by naturalistic means, but he will use the blind watchmaker to try to explain it, to say it still could happen. So it's the appearance of illusion. So when you break down the basic constructs of materialism, ultimately, if you've got matter colliding with matter, that leaves us with no free will. That's the bottom line to materialism. It really is. If you take materialism to its logical conclusion, there is no free will. Now, in 2 lessons from tonight, I'm going to present evidence that there certainly is free will, and that's been even substantiated scientifically. But for the materialist, there really isn't free will. If you've got matter colliding with matter, if all our brains are molecules colliding with molecules, then there can be no free will. That's the ultimate consequence of materialism. It has to be. And as a result of that, there's a lot of other things that are consequences. There's certainly no soul, no life afterwards. There's no soul in our bodies. There cannot really be the concept of wrong, right or wrong. There cannot be that. If it's matter colliding with matter, how can there be? There can't be the concept of right or wrong. Mind, once again, no, you don't have a mind, you have a brain. Well, again, we'll show evidence in a few lessons that there is a distinction between mind and brain. There are 2 separate things, believe it or not. There is the brain, and there's functions of the brain, but there's parts of our mind that cannot be quantified in the brain or in a physical state. The concept of justice. Where would that come from if you've got molecules banging into molecules? Where would it come from? How about moral law? Where would you get that? There is no moral law. It can't be if you're a pure materialist. Thankfully, most materialists, I will say, aren't this strict. They will understand, yeah, there has to be a right and wrong. There has to be some moral justice. There has to be some codes. But if you take it to its logical conclusion, there can't be. And of course, there can't be any hope either, can there? For the materialist, there is no hope. And I think it's a kind of a sad proposition, to tell you the truth. Paul warns the Colossians to beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. Now, was Paul talking about materialism specifically there? I don't know if he wasn't or not, but it still applies, doesn't it? It's a philosophy of men, and beware of people trying to take you through these vain philosophies, these empty deceit, according to the traditions of men and according to the world. It's a materialistic view. It's something man invented and is not biblical. Also to Timothy, Paul writes, "O Timothy, guard what is committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge." You can put in parentheses around knowledge even the word science. What has been falsely called knowledge or science. We need to avoid those things. They are contradictions to what we believe and what I think the evidence shows. So as mentioned before, materialism identifies itself with science. They're not equal. In fact, some would say you really can't do good science if you're materialist, because you have to deny a lot of things, right, wrong, truth, absolute truth. You can't have that if you're a materialist. So how do you identify materialism with science, but yet say creationism cannot equal science? Creationism is not scientific. No, that's not true. Good science has been practiced by Christians for many, many centuries. Michael Ignor, and I hope I'm saying his name right, he is a neurosurgeon out of Stony Brook in New York. He says that materialism is not even a philosophy, it's a mistake. 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5. That's a mistake. And materialism is a mistake. It is not coherent, according to Dr. Ignor. And materialists, they deny the form and pay a lot of attention to the detail. You get into science, you start looking at DNA, and you start looking at other scientific endeavors. They seem to really put all their emphasis on the very detail, not looking at the form or the why or the purpose. And I think better science can be done when you start with what's the purpose of this? What's the functionality of what you're looking at? And not just looking at the detail. As Dr. Ignor says, if you're a committed materialist, he says, this is his quote, you can't do good science. You just can't do it. So it's really opposite from that. So neither materialism or creation can be proven by science. We can give evidence for both, but was the materialist there at the beginning of the Big Bang? If there was such a thing, obviously. No, they can't prove it. Were we there when God created the earth? No, we can't absolutely prove it, but we can certainly give evidence for it. So for that reason alone, materialism and creationism, they cannot be proven by science. They're not amenable to the scientific method. Creationism is not amenable to the scientific method, but neither is materialism. It's just, again, a worldview. And Josh Gertler points out, once again, if the universe is an accident, it cannot account for the laws of logic, universal morality, and the laws of nature. Where did these laws come from? If it's matter colliding with matter. That's why you heard me say before, the materialists sometimes deny logic even exists. Now that's tough. But if you got matter colliding with matter, I would argue, where does it come from? Is it logical to think logically? Same thing with the laws of the universe. Thermodynamics, we'll look at those later on in this lesson. The laws of relativity and quantum theory and all that. Where do those come from? If it's matter coming from matter, and what sometimes is referred to as the laws of nature. So I think that's a good point. And so why is that? And I think the Bible does talk a little bit about this. We look at Romans 8, verse 7 and 8. Paul says that the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God. And I'll quote verse 8, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. Then those who are in the flesh cannot please God. I believe this is, at least in part, what we're talking about in Romans here. The carnal man, the fleshly man, doesn't want to look to the spiritual side. They don't want to look to things of God. They don't want to observe those things. And so, as a result, they'll stay in their sin and be lost. And then 1 Corinthians, Paul also writes, but the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. What does the materialist consider the creationist? Fools, bottom line. We're silly, believing in fables. What we believe in is fables or stories. And so that's what they look upon as you and me. We're the fools. And they consider the belief in Jesus Christ and his resurrection foolishness. And nor can they know them because they are spiritually discerned. It takes someone willing to think spiritually. So what are the consequences? They're dire, in my opinion. They're dire. And this is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a great philosopher, the German philosopher who was, by the way, out of his mind when he died, I think, because of believing this stuff. Some people said he had some disease like syphilis or whatever, but he was certainly out of his mind when he died. Nietzsche said, you have your way, I have my way. As for the correct way and the right way, it doesn't exist. There is no right or wrong. And so you can see how Nazism could be propagated from this kind of idea. You can see where Hitler got his ideas, where the Nazis got their ideas. If there's no right way or no wrong way, then you can do whatever you want to do. And then it becomes dependent on what society decides is right or wrong, which is to some extent where we're at today, isn't it? So it's hard for the materialist to condemn anything. How can you condemn anything? Genocide, abortion, the Holocaust, you name it. How can you really condemn anything? That's why it's an incoherent philosophy. It collapses on itself. You really can't condemn it. And when pressed to the true materialist, naturalist, they will have to agree with you on that. In fact, that's what happened with David Silverman. He was pressed on this issue. Well, then can you really condemn Nazi Germany? Can you? He said, no, it's hard. The hard answer is that the Nazis, thought they were doing objective good. They did. In my book, The Evolution Delusion, I quote a Nazi in that book who says that he just thought he was doing what was right. Adolf Eichmann. If any of you read that book, you remember that quote I have. And when they took him to trial and he was eventually hanged for the atrocities that he did in the name of Nazism, he thought he was doing right. He thought he was doing God's work by eliminating the inferior, although I think his concept of God would be different than yours and I's. If I don't think he really believed in a God. But he went to his death believing that. So it's really a very dire consequences of materialism, and unfortunately we're starting to see that in our society, I believe. Now the right for a woman to choose, which is a euphemism for murder, really, is more important than the right of a baby to live, and all of the atrocities that we see. So I'm going to briefly give a materialist version of the beginning of the universe, which I think most of y'all know. This is in your paper that I gave you. By the way, lesson 3 is on the back, so get that before you leave. And there's more lesson 2 if you don't have that for tonight. And this is a picture that actually comes from NASA. You can get this on the website and look at this picture. And it's just the concept of the Big Bang. And so and you just look at this, it goes through the stages of the development of the universe. And it has their quantum fluctuations and inflation at the very beginning. I hope you can see that. The materialists no longer believe that matter has always existed. Now that's what we used to think, and that's what I think they used to think. But they won't say that anymore, because that creates a problem. That brings them back to the kind of steady state concept that the universe has always existed. So if matter always existed, now they're back into that sort of same state. So they won't say that. So what they say is quantum fluctuations in a vacuum is what started the Big Bang. That sort of begs the question, though, doesn't it? Where did the vacuum come from? Where did the quantum fluctuation come from, if there is such a thing as that? And I think there is such a thing as quantum fluctuations. But a vacuum is something. It's not nothing. So they're really back to the same point. It's just they're not using the word matter. And then in 10 to the minus 23 seconds, by the way, that's a very quick time. That's faster than the speed of light, basically. The Big Bang occurred. And so you had the beginning of the Big Bang. Now, during that time, something there, and you'll see it at the very top, left-hand corner, it uses the word inflation. Now, inflation was an idea put out by Alan Guth, who said that the math doesn't work for the Big Bang. It doesn't work. So they invented something called inflation, because in order for it to work, the process has to be sped up. And so, as far as we know, nothing goes faster than the speed of light. But for the Big Bang to be accurate, something had to go faster than the speed of light during those first 10 to the minus 23 seconds. And that's what inflation is. It's a made-up thing. But every materialist accepts it. There's no proof for it whatsoever. And then you had the Dark Ages, and then you had eventually particles coming together to form our basic molecules as we know them today. First hydrogen, and then helium. All these particles, you can divide each molecule down to further and further smaller things like bosons and so on and so forth. But eventually hydrogen formed, then helium through the act of fusion produces a lot of energy. And then eventually you had stars that were formed. And then after that, you would have other compounds formed, like carbon and other compounds. By the way, there's no real good materialist explanation on how stars formed. It's just, it was gravity. Well, gravity would require that it acted on these particles, and we don't have any evidence that gravity really works on small particles like that. But yet, they have to have that. But anyway, eventually stars formed, then the galaxies formed, and then eventually carbon was formed. Also, don't have a good explanation for how carbon came about. And we're going to look at this also in a further lesson as well. But we don't have a good explanation for that. The materialists don't. When I say we, the materialists don't. Then once you have carbon, now you've got carbon, the basis for life, and you got nucleotides and so forth that came together to form RNA. RNA comes together to form DNA. By the way, you've got to have enzymes for RNA to form. Where did the enzymes come from? They would have had to have been made before the RNA formed. Does that make sense to you? No, it doesn't. So none of this makes any sense, but it is a story. It's one of those just so stories that Lewontin was talking about. And then eventually life somehow came up out of a primordial bubble when these nucleotides came together. Again, we've never been able to do that. That'll be our next lesson. And then finally humans would come about. That's a brief explanation. It's a little bit more detail in your handout, but that's a brief explanation of the materialist worldview. The biblical worldview, quite different, isn't it? And the universe had a beginning. And that, by the way, seems to be something that the materialists would agree with. And it was created by God. It didn't occur by naturalistic means. And man was created in the image of God. And there are absolute truths. And again, I go into a little bit more detail about all this in your handout, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but that's an overview of a biblical worldview, and there's obviously a whole lot more to it than that. But there is an omnipotent God, an omniscient God, powerful God of all powerful intellect that caused the universe to begin. When something begins, it implies a cause. Anything that has a beginning has a cause. At least that's the way we observe it in life today. So if the universe had a beginning, it had a cause. We'll be looking at that next week a little bit more. So that means a cause implies something, and God would be that something. And again, the biblical worldview does not contradict science. I want to emphasize that one more time. A biblical worldview does not contradict science. And there's nothing in the Bible that I've read to date that contradicts science, except when it's clear that a miracle's being performed. When something supernatural is going on, then we know that is a supernatural thing. But as far as the world and the way the world functions and so forth, nothing in the Bible contradicts that. Admittedly, the Bible's not a book of science. We don't need to make it into a book of science. Some people have tried to do that a little bit. They get into trouble. But nothing in science contradicts the Bible, and the Bible doesn't contradict science. And I will say this, as science discovers more and more and more, it becomes more and more obvious that there has to be design behind it. There just does. When you start looking at the details of how certain animals function, we'll be looking at later on how birds migrate. How do they do that? When we start, and now we're starting to learn how they do it. There's a way that they do it, and it's not just instinct by itself, but something had to have caused that. And so when you look at science, more and more science proves the biblical worldview. And the bigger thing is the biblical worldview offers hope. If there's no other reason to be a Christian, it's this right here. We've got hope. How miserable it is to live a life without hope. I would hate to be that person. Now, it's my belief that, and we're going to talk about a few physical laws here because they are going to be applicable, believe it or not, to our study as we move along. Therefore, we're going to present them now. Because I do believe God, at creation, caused these physical laws, the way the world works, were all created at the beginning of time. And time had a beginning, by the way. What was before time? Bible talks about the beginning of time, several places. So time had a beginning. Einstein proposed his theory of relativity back in the early 1900s when he was just a kid, basically, in the early 20s. And his special theory of relativity says that the laws of physics are the same for all observers in uniform motion relative to one another. And it's a good thing there is relativity, because if there wasn't, you and I could not fly on a plane and eat a sandwich at the same time. You couldn't do it. That's relativity. It didn't have to be that way. The world did not have to be made that way, but the laws of physics are the same in uniform motion. So you could literally play ping pong on a plane as long as you weren't experiencing turbulence. Okay? And the only way you can do that is because of this. Now, say, well, everybody knew that, but Einstein put it in theory form. He's the one who figured out the more detail. And it's a basic law of the way our universe works. And if it, again, wasn't that way, we would be in trouble. So I would ask to try to prove this point, how fast are you moving right now? But in reality, you're moving extremely fast. And I'll just go through this quickly. The rotation of the Earth, like you just said, is 1,000 miles per hour. I'm putting these in miles per hour, by the way. But you also have the rotation of the Earth around the sun. That's movement, isn't it? That's 22,000 miles per hour. And then you have the sun's movement through the galaxy. The sun is moving through the galaxy. And guess what? Our galaxy is moving through the universe. When you add all of these up, you're moving at 1.9 million miles per hour right now as you're sitting in your chair in the pew there. And so am I. That's pretty fast. We could not do that without relativity, by the way. Wouldn't work. So it's a good thing. Now, the one thing that was peculiar that Einstein realized is light is an exception. Light is measured the same regardless of what motion it is in. So if you were to measure the speed of light, and I didn't put the speed of light in here, but if you measured the speed of light in this room, we would get a number. But if we measured the speed of light in an airplane going 500 miles per hour, we would get the exact same number. That's a peculiarity of light. And that one little thing, along with the basic theory of relativity, leads to some really significant consequences, not consequences, but ideas that only Einstein had the mind to think of. Now, it seems kind of obvious to us now in some ways, but only Einstein at the time had the idea, the mind to do that. Einstein proposed that light had mass. Who would have thought of that? But he said it has to, and that's been proven. Edrington proved that with the eclipse of the sun. He was able to see that light was bent when there was a total eclipse of the sun, indicating that there was mass. So it had to be there. Then a few years later, he came up with his general theory of relativity, and that is, he was trying to look at a theory of what caused gravity. And gravity, in Einstein's mind, was a warping of the time-space continuum, and that sort of seems to be what gravity is. A lot more to it than that. So as a result of relativity and the speed of the light being the same, no matter where you are when you measure it and how fast you're moving, you come up with this idea of time dilation. And let me tell you, this is a very difficult concept to grasp if you're really stuck in just, hard, fast mathematics and so forth. But it seems to be true. And what does that mean? Gravitational time dilation is when time runs slower in higher gravitational field. So if you're in a big gravitational field, time's going to run slower than if you were floating around above it. It also runs faster relative to velocity. The faster you're traveling, the slower time runs. So as a result, you get the idea that time is not absolute. Say 30 minutes an hour is absolute. No, it isn't. It is not absolute. It depends on where you're at, gravitational-wise, and how fast you're moving. And so there's this idea of the twin paradox, and you may have heard of this before. And this seems to be borne out. They have atomic clocks that have proven that time isn't absolute. So to deny it is to sort of deny the evidence. But twins born on the same day, this is a typical scenario. Twins born on the same day, one stays on Earth and the other travels to the nearest star system 4 light years away at 0.8 c, which is the velocity of light, and returns. On return, how old will the twin be on Earth versus the twin astronaut that comes back? You say, well, they're the same. No, they're not. The answer is the Earth twin will be 10 years old and the astronaut twin will be 6 years old. And this is using the time dilation equation, the Lorentz equation. Also, Einstein realized that energy was vitally important, and there was a result of mass times the speed of light squared, and that's where you get your atomic bomb from, basically. I'm going through this quickly, understand. Then you have the other guiding principle of our Earth, which is quantum theory. Quantum theory basically says that a wave, particles have both a wave and a mass duality. So if you look at an electron, it looks like it has mass, but then it also looks like it has a wave. And that there's an uncertainty principle. You can't know the velocity and know the location at the same time. And that's the uncertainty principle. It has very important consequences, but quantum theory seems to be true. That's why we have microwaves. That's how we have other electronics that we have today, cellular phones and so forth. We're running out of time, but the last 2 laws I want to look at are the first law of thermodynamics. And these laws are meta laws. There's actually 4 laws of thermodynamics, but the first 2 are the ones that are really important for our study. And that is the conservation of energy. And there's never been an experiment, by the way, that's ever disproved relativity. There's never been an experiment that has ever disproved thermodynamics. They seem to be meta laws that God created. And the law of conservation of energy is we're not making any more energy, basically. You can't add or subtract energy to a system. You can change it, but you can't add or subtract it. And then the second law of thermodynamics is entropy, and that is disorder is always increasing. And that seemed to be a very fundamental law, and we'll be looking at this particular law of thermodynamics next week when we look at the cosmologic arguments for a higher being. I would like to end to what I would call the biblical worldview summed up by the Bible. So if you have your Bibles, look at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And then if we have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them at that point. But I'm going to sum up what I call the biblical worldview, that I think is a good place to start when looking at the biblical worldview. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in the past to the fathers by prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir to all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, and he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. That's a fairly good summary of the biblical worldview. All right, so next week we'll get into, I'd say, the kind of meat and potatoes of it all. We're going to look at what I call the philosophical or logical arguments for God. I appreciate your attendance.